The match was a small thing, such a small, insignificant thing, a sliver of wood no longer than a lady's finger, tipped with sulphur and spite. Yet in Lady Natasha Burton Kelly's elegant hand it held the weight of an entire dynasty. She stood alone in the Kelly Manor archives at the dead hour of midnight, her silk dressing-gown pooling at her feet like spilled wine, her eyes moving slowly across the shelves. 40 years of land grants, tenancy rolls, correspondence bearing the Crown's wax seal, the breathing, documented proof of everything the Kellys had ever been, and everything she had spent a decade trying to bury. Her lips curved. "If I cannot rule this dirt," she whispered to the dark, "then no one shall." The match kissed the first page of vellum, and the Kelly name began to burn. Lola smelled it before she saw it. She had been standing on the east balcony of Nottingham Manor, her balcony now, though the word still felt borrowed, watching the last fingers of dusk release the northern fields. The air had carried the cold, clean scent of heather and coming autumn. Then something shifted, a wrongness beneath the wind. Smoke. Jaden, his name left her lips like a flare. He was already moving. They rode hard across the ridge separating the two estates, and Lola saw the amber glow bleeding through the ground-floor windows of Kelly Manor's east wing long before the horses reached the gate. Her chest became stone. Those windows, the archives, every document her father had ever signed, every ledger that proved the northern acreage was hers by blood and by law, all of it was behind that golden, terrible light. She did not wait for the groom. The side entrance gave way under Jaden's shoulder, and smoke poured out to meet them like a living thing. Lola pressed her sleeve to her face and plunged forward, her eyes streaming, the heat pressing against her skin with flat, brutal palms. Behind her, she heard Jaden commanding the night staff, heard the distant shout for water buckets and wet canvas, but she could only move forward, deeper into the orange throat of it. She found it on the floor, half fallen from a burning shelf. One ledger, thick, old, the cover scorched black and still hot to the touch, but the interior, the pages, miraculously, stubbornly intact. She clutched it to her chest and ran. Outside, gasping, she and Jaden stood in the gravel drive while the household threw water on the smoldering walls. He wrapped his coat around her shaking shoulders without a word. Lola opened the ruined cover with trembling fingers. The candlelight from the doorway caught the first column of figures, numbers that made no sense against her father's estate, loans signed in a hand that looked like hers, but was not. Her blood ran cold. She looked up at Jaden. His jaw was set, his eyes already hard with fury held in careful check. "She didn't burn it all," Lola said quietly. "No," he agreed, reading over her shoulder, "but she meant to." The shadow debts were real, and Natasha's war had only just changed its battlefield. The ledger told its story in cold, precise columns. Lola sat at her father's old desk in the Nottingham study, the charred ledger open before her, alongside 3 others that Jaden had retrieved from the manor's secondary strongbox, one Natasha had apparently overlooked in her haste. The candles had burned low by the time the full shape of it became clear. Outside, the northern wind pressed against the windows like something that wanted in. The loans had begun 14 months after her father's funeral. They were elegant forgeries, she would grant Natasha that. The signature was hers in every measurable way, the slight leftward lean of the L, the looped tail of the Y, even the small hesitation mark her father had always teased her about, the tiny ghost stroke before she committed the pen to paper. Someone had studied her hand with the patience of a surgeon and the soul of a thief. 5 separate creditors, £43,000 across 18 months, each note signed Miss Lola Kelly, heir of the Northern Kelly estate, borrowing against land she hadn't yet legally claimed, land that Natasha had simultaneously been contesting in the lower courts. The circular brilliance of it made her stomach turn. Natasha had created the debt while blocking the inheritance, ensuring that the moment Lola won the land, she would be immediately swallowed by obligations she never made. A trap dressed in her own handwriting. "She planned this before my father was cold," Lola said. Her voice was very quiet. The quietest anger always ran the deepest. Jaden stood by the fire, arms crossed, saying nothing. He had learned, somewhere in the months of standing beside her, that Lola's silences were not invitations for comfort, they were the sound of a mind sharpening itself. She turned the final page. At the bottom of the last loan document, beneath the forged signature, was a creditor's stamp she didn't recognize. Not a London bank, not a northern merchant house. A small embossed vulture, wings spread, head bowed, above the initials G.V. and Associates. She pressed her finger to it. "Do you know this mark?" Jaden crossed the room and leaned over her shoulder. A pause, then with a precision that told her he was choosing his words carefully. "I have seen it once, at a table I should not have been sitting at." She turned to look at him. His expression was controlled, but something moved behind his eyes, old and unpleasant. The gilded vulture. It is not a firm, exactly. It is a syndicate, men of money who purchase distressed debts and ruined estates at auction, then sell the pieces to foreign interests. They don't lend money to help people, Lola. They lend money to own them. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 3. "And Natasha found them," Lola said. "Or they found her. Either way, they have your signature on £43,000 of nothing, and he reached past her and turned to the final document's date of demand, 28 days, they will present those notes to the Crown Debt Commission. The northern acreage goes to auction before the summer quarter ends." 28 days, a month to dismantle a conspiracy assembled over 2 years. Lola closed the ledger. She pressed both palms flat against its scorched cover and breathed, steadily, deliberately, the way Lady Tia had taught her when the world tilted on its axis and you could not afford to fall with it. She had spent the better part of a year learning to fight in fields and lower courts, trading in tenant rights and entailment law. That world she understood. But this, syndicate financiers, forged instruments, the machinery of London's shadow economy, this was a different battlefield entirely, one where her northern stubbornness and her father's name meant very little. She would need new weapons. As if reading the precise moment her mind arrived at its conclusion, Jaden straightened. "I will send word to Lady Tia in the morning." I was about to say the same thing. The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close enough. "I know." She rose from the desk, the ledger tucked under her arm. She would not leave it behind again, would not leave anything behind that could be touched by Natasha's careful, destructive hands. Tomorrow there would be letters to write and a solicitor to wake from his comfortable ignorance. There would be the long, necessary conversation with her estate manager about which assets could be liquidated honestly and quickly to begin reducing the debt's appearance of legitimacy while they worked to expose the fraud beneath it. But that was tomorrow. Tonight she walked to the window and looked north across the dark ridge of her land. Her land. Whatever paper Natasha had poisoned, whatever phantom debts now floated above the acreage like an unpaid curse, the earth itself did not lie. It had been Kelly ground for 3 generations. It would remain so. She felt Jaden come to stand beside her, not touching, not speaking, simply there, the way he always was, a fixed point. She had stopped pretending some weeks ago that she didn't rely on it. She thought burning the archive would erase the proof, but she left a witness. She glanced down at the ledger. Every forged signature is still a signature. Every false loan still has a lender. We follow the money back to its source, and we find the hand that held the stamp. And then? Lola turned from the window. The candlelight caught the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes, the look that her tenants had already begun to call the Kelly look, though she didn't yet know it. Then we make the gilded vulture wish it had chosen easier prey.
Lady Tia Riley arrived at Nottingham Manor before the dew had lifted. She came the way she always did, without announcement and without apology, her travelling coach rolling up the gravelled drive at an hour that most of polite society considered an affront to civilization. She was already inside and pouring herself tea from the sideboard by the time Lola descended the stairs, dressed but barely, her hair half-pinned. Tia looked her over with the calm, surgical assessment of a woman who had survived 4 London seasons, 2 inheritance disputes, and a brief, spectacular engagement to an Austrian count. "You look like someone who has been reading bad news by candlelight," she said. "I have been," Lola replied. "Good. Bring it with you." Tia set down her cup. "We leave for London at noon." The journey south took 2 days. Tia spent the first day listening, really listening, in the way that made her dangerous, as Lola laid out the full architecture of Natasha's scheme. The forged signatures, the syndicate stamp, the 26 days remaining before the Crown Debt Commission convened. She interrupted only twice, once to ask the precise figure of the largest individual loan, and once, near the end, to say a single name quietly to herself, as though confirming a long-held suspicion. The gilded vulture. "You know of them," Lola said. It was not a question. "I know of the man who runs them." Tia's gaze drifted to the passing countryside, and something in her expression sharpened and cooled simultaneously, the look of someone recalling a chess match they had never quite finished. "Lord Edmund Voss. He presents himself as a private financier of good standing. He is received everywhere. Almack's, the Rotherfield dinners, the Duke of Ashmore's card evenings." A pause. "He is also the most patient predator in London, and he has never once left fingerprints on a single one of his acquisitions." "Until now," Lola said. Tia finally turned from the window. The faintest, most aristocratic smile Lola had ever seen moved across her lips. "Until now." London received them on a grey Tuesday morning with all the warmth of a creditor's letter. Tia's townhouse on Cavendish Square was immaculate and formidably staffed, the kind of establishment that operated with military precision beneath an effortless elegance. Within hours of their arrival, Lola had been measured by a modiste, assessed by Tia's personal lady's maid, and issued a series of quiet but non-negotiable instructions about how the next 3 weeks would proceed.
"You are not here as Miss Kelly of the North," Tia told her that evening, standing behind her at the dressing mirror. "That name carries a regional dispute and a whiff of creditor trouble. Neither will open the doors we need." She met Lola's eyes in the glass. "You are here as my guest, my particular guest, which means every room that receives me receives you, and every person who wants my favor will extend you theirs." Lola studied her own reflection, the deep emerald gown, the careful arrangement of her dark hair, the pearls at her throat that Tia had pressed on her without discussion. She looked like someone she almost recognized. "And Voss?" she asked. "Voss will be at Lady Harrington's musicale on Thursday. He attends religiously. It is where he does his quietest business, beneath Handel and polite applause." Tia smoothed an invisible crease from Lola's shoulder. "You will not approach him. You will not look for him. You will be so thoroughly, magnificently uninterested in Lord Edmund Voss that he will seek an introduction himself. Men like him cannot resist a beautiful woman who doesn't need anything from them. It disturbs their understanding of the world." Lola almost smiled. "And what do I do when he finds me?" "You listen." Tia's voice was velvet over iron. "You ask nothing of consequence, you say even less, and you let him believe, thoroughly, completely, that you are simply a charming provincial girl enjoying her first proper season." She stepped back to appraise the full picture. "Can you do that?" Lola thought of the charred ledger, of her father's forged signature, of 26 days and £43,000, and a syndicate that had never once been made to answer for its hunger. "I can do whatever is necessary," she said. Tia nodded once, with the quiet satisfaction of a general who had found the right officer for a difficult posting. "Then we begin Thursday." The musicale was everything Lola had expected and nothing she was prepared for. The rooms were gilded and breathless, packed with the precise density of people who mattered and people who desperately wished to. Conversation moved in overlapping currents. Who had married badly? Who had invested wisely? Whose country estate was quietly failing beneath a cheerful exterior? Lola moved through it all on Tia's arm, smiling at introductions, deflecting inquiries about the North with the practiced lightness she had spent 2 days rehearsing. She was a student, a huntress in training, learning the particular grammar of a ballroom battlefield. She found Voss before he found her, she was certain of that, though she gave no sign of it. He was a lean man of 50, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the easy, unhurried manner of someone who had never needed to chase anything. He stood near the pianoforte with a glass of claret, watching the room with half-lidded eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The stamp on the ledger, the wings spread, the head bowed. "There you are," she thought, and turned away to laugh at something Tia was saying, bright and careless and entirely unconcerned. Across the room she felt his gaze find her and settle. The hunt, at last, had turned.
Jaden did not tell Lola where he was going. This was not deception, it was the particular mercy of a man who understood that some battles were better fought without an audience, especially when the audience in question would insist on fighting alongside him. Lola had her ballrooms and her careful silences, and Lady Tia's precise orchestration. He had other tools and other rooms. He left Cavendish Square at 10 in the evening, dressed not as the Duke of Nottingham, but as something slightly less. Good coat, no crest, the kind of careful anonymity that old money wore when it wanted to move without announcement. His driver knew the address. In certain circles of London, everyone knew the address. Carver's was not on any respectable map. It occupied the upper floors of a German street building whose ground level housed a perfectly legitimate bookshop, a detail that amused its members endlessly. You entered through a side passage, climbed 2 flights, and arrived in a series of connected rooms that smelled of tobacco, expensive brandy, and the specific tension of men wagering things they could not afford to lose. No women, no clocks, no windows. Carver's existed outside of time and consequence, which was precisely why the right people loved it and the wrong people feared it. Jaden was known here, though he had not visited in 2 years. The room absorbed him without ceremony, which was its own form of welcome. He found the man he was looking for within the hour. Gerald Fitch was not a remarkable-looking person, which was, Jaden suspected, his greatest professional asset. Medium height, thinning hair, the soft, unmemorable face of a solicitor's clerk. He sat at the faro table in the East Room with a modest stack of chips and the quietly watchful eyes of a man who was never really playing the game in front of him. He was Voss's instrument, the one who held the physical notes, who transferred debt ownership, who kept the syndicate's paperwork clean and its principals invisible. Jaden had spent 3 days finding this out. He had not shared the process with Lola because 3 of those days had involved calling in favors he'd accumulated over a decade from men whose names appeared in no drawing-room conversation.
He settled into the empty chair across the table and bought into the game. Fitch glanced at him, looked away, looked back. "Nottingham," he said, without warmth. "Fitch," Jaden replied, with even less. They played for 2 hours, and Jaden lost deliberately. Not extravagantly, not in a way that announced itself, but consistently enough that the table relaxed around him, that Fitch's narrow shoulders dropped a half-inch from their habitual guard. Jaden understood the arithmetic of manufactured vulnerability. A man who was winning felt untouchable. A man who was losing felt briefly, dangerously generous. By midnight, the other players had drifted away, and they were nearly alone. Jaden set down his cards and reached inside his coat. He placed a banker's draft on the table, a figure that made Fitch go very still. Enough to clear the man's own considerable debts, which Jaden also knew about, because he had made it his business to know. "I want the Kelly notes," Jaden said, simply, without theatre.
Fitch stared at the draft. His jaw worked silently. "Those instruments belong to the syndicate. I don't have the authority." "You have the physical custody. That's all I need." Jaden kept his voice pleasant. "Mr. Fitch, I am not asking you to betray your employer. I am asking you to sell a debt instrument to a buyer with adequate funds, which is precisely what debt instruments are designed for. There is nothing here that breaches your arrangement with Voss." It was true, and they both knew it. The beauty of the syndicate's own structure, the clean, anonymous transfer of notes, was now its vulnerability. Fitch could sell legitimately, and Voss, insulated by layers of plausible distance, could not easily object without revealing precisely how much he cared about a particular set of documents. Fitch looked at the draft for a long time. "This doesn't come back to me," he said finally. "I have never been in this room," Jaden agreed. The notes exchanged hands beneath the table, 5 folded documents, each bearing Lola's forged signature, each a small paper monument to Natasha's patient cruelty. Jaden slipped them inside his coat without looking at them. He had known what they were for weeks. Seeing them would make the anger difficult to manage, and he required the anger to remain manageable for a while longer. He stood, buttoned his coat, and left Fitch to whatever remained of his conscience. Outside, the London night was cool and indifferent. He stood on the pavement for a moment, one hand pressed flat against his chest where the notes sat against his ribs. £43,000 of fiction. Lola's name signed to a lie, over and over, by a woman who had looked at everything the Kellys built and decided it would be simpler to simply erase them. He thought of Lola at that desk, pressing her palms to the scorched ledger with a steadiness that had made something in his chest ache with a feeling he had stopped pretending was merely concern. He had bought back the legal fiction of her debt tonight. But what the notes actually represented, the audacity of the theft, the intimacy of the forgery, the years of careful, gleeful destruction, that was not something a banker's draft could resolve. That would require a courtroom. But tonight, at least, the weapons were fewer. He walked back toward Cavendish Square through the quiet streets, the notes pressed against his heart like a promise he had not yet spoken aloud. He would tell her in the morning. She would be furious that he had gone alone. He found, with some surprise, that he was already looking forward to it.
The letter arrived on a Wednesday, tucked between 2 invitations and a florist's bill. Lola almost missed it. The handwriting was deliberately small, the seal plain wax with no crest, the kind of correspondence designed to look like nothing at all. She might have set it aside entirely, if not for the single word written on the inner fold when she broke it open. "Please." She read it twice. Then she sat down. Isabelle Burton Kelly had never, in the full length of Lola's memory, used that word. Not to servants, not to her mother, certainly not to the stepsister she had spent the better part of a decade treating as a tolerated inconvenience. Isabelle was her mother's creature, languid, decorative, occasionally vicious in the precise way that beautiful, bored young women sometimes were. She had stood at Natasha's shoulder through every maneuver, every social cut, every legal challenge, a silent endorsement dressed in expensive silk. But the letter in Lola's hands did not read like the Isabelle she knew. It read like someone who had been standing too close to a fire for too long and only just noticed the burns. I cannot say more in writing. Come to the east entrance of Harrington Park tomorrow at 3. Come alone. Tell no one, especially not him. Him was underlined twice. Lola folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket closest to her body. She told Jaden, of course, not because she disregarded Isabelle's instruction, but because she had learned, painfully over months of navigating Natasha's labyrinthine scheming, that walking into unmarked rooms without leaving a map behind was the kind of romantic recklessness that got estates lost. Jaden listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It could be Natasha's arrangement," he said. "It could be," Lola agreed, "but the handwriting shook. Natasha's hand never shakes." Another silence. He looked at the folded letter in her palm, then at her face. Whatever he found there seemed to settle something in him, though the set of his jaw remained. "I'll be 50 yards east," he said. "You won't see me." She nodded. That was the agreement, and neither of them required more words to seal it. Harrington Park in the afternoon was all long shadows and the smell of turned autumn leaves, the kind of beauty that felt vaguely melancholy, as though the season itself was practicing a graceful decline. Lola arrived at the east entrance 2 minutes before 3 and found Isabelle already there, standing apart from the gate with her arms crossed tightly across her chest and her eyes doing the anxious darting work of a woman who had checked over her shoulder too many times to count. She looked terrible. This was the observation Lola hadn't expected, not the fact of Isabelle's distress, which she'd anticipated, but its specific texture. The careful veneer that Natasha had spent years applying to her daughter, the right posture, the right expression, the cultivated air of cool, unassailable superiority, had thinned to something almost transparent. Underneath it was a young woman who had not been sleeping. They stood 3 feet apart and regarded each other with the complicated wariness of people who shared a history too tangled for easy summary. "You came," Isabelle said. "You asked," Lola replied. It came out in pieces, the way difficult truths usually did. Natasha had not consulted Isabelle about the forged notes. She had not consulted her about the syndicate, or the creditor scheme, or the plan to auction the northern acreage. She had simply built the machinery and expected her daughter to stand beside it and smile, as she always had, because that was Isabelle's function in her mother's world, decorative, loyal, and entirely without opinion. But somewhere in the grinding months of legal maneuver and London scheming, Isabelle had begun to understand the full shape of what her mother was. Not a wronged woman reclaiming what was owed to her, not a widow fighting for her household. A woman who had married a grieving man for his land, poisoned his confidence in his own daughter, and was now attempting to burn the evidence of it all before anyone looked too closely. "She used my name, too," Isabelle said, and her voice cracked precisely once before she brought it back under control. "On 2 of the smaller instruments. I didn't know until last month. She told me they were household accounts." Lola said nothing. She let the silence do its necessary work. "I have the stamps," Isabelle continued. She was steadier now, steadier in the way that people became when they had finally stepped off a precipice and realized the falling was easier than the standing. "The forgery equipment. She keeps it in the blue trunk in her dressing room. I know where the key is." A pause. I want passage, away from her, away from London, away of all of it. I have a school friend in Edinburgh. If I had money enough for the journey and the first quarter's board. Done, Lola said. Isabelle blinked. She had clearly prepared herself for negotiation, for conditions and suspicion, and the particular coldness that Lola would have been entirely justified in offering. The simple, immediate answer disarmed her completely. Her composure held for approximately 4 more seconds. Then it didn't. Lola did not embrace her stepsister. That would have been a fiction too far, and they both knew it. But she stepped forward and put a steady hand on Isabelle's arm and held it there while the other woman gathered herself back together, piece by careful piece. "We will need your testimony," Lola said when Isabelle had quieted, "in writing and possibly in person, a courtroom if it comes to that." Isabelle straightened. Something moved through her expression, not courage exactly, but its practical cousin, resolution. "I know," Isabelle said. "That's why I wrote to you." In the middle distance, 50 yards east, a figure stood entirely still among the trees. Lola did not look at him, but she felt, with a certainty she had stopped questioning, that he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. As was she. Almack's assembly rooms on a Wednesday evening was the closest thing London had to a court of final judgment. Not the legal kind, the kind that actually mattered, the kind where reputations were tried and sentenced in the space between one dance and the next, where a single tilted chin or misplaced word could undo a family's standing with the quiet, permanent efficiency of a door being closed and locked from the inside. The patronesses understood this. The members understood this. Everyone who passed through those famous doors understood that they were not simply attending an entertainment. They were being assessed. Lola understood it too, which was precisely why she had chosen it. The preparation had taken 4 days. Tia had handled the strategic architecture, who would stand where, which conversations needed to happen before the principal one, which of her considerable network of social allies could be trusted to be in the right room at the right time without being told exactly why. She had the particular gift of people who had played long games for many years. She could arrange outcomes without appearing to arrange anything at all. Lola had handled Voss. Over the preceding week, she had allowed him to believe he was the one doing the pursuing. She had been precisely warm enough at Lady Pemberton's dinner to encourage, and precisely distracted enough at the Rotherfield recital to intrigue. She had laughed at one of his observations, a real laugh, which she suspected unsettled him more than a performed one would have, and then excused herself before the conversation could become substantial. She was, in short, everything Tia had instructed her to be, unattainable in a way that felt almost accidental. By the time Wednesday arrived, Lord Edmund Voss was thoroughly convinced that the introduction of Miss Kelly into his evening was his own idea. Men like him always were. She arrived at Almack's on Tia's arm in pale gold silk, her dark hair dressed simply, deliberately understated in a room that rewarded understatement. The effect, she was given to understand, by the sudden quality of attention that followed their entrance, was adequate. Voss found her within 20 minutes. Of course he did. Miss Kelly, he materialized at her elbow between one conversation and the next, smooth and unhurried, with the air of a man entirely accustomed to the best of everything extending itself in his direction. "I had hoped you would be here this evening." "Had you?" She turned to him with an expression of pleasant, faintly distracted warmth. "How kind." They moved through the usual architecture of ballroom conversation, the season, the weather, a mutual acquaintance's recent engagement. Voss was good at this, practiced, fluent, never revealing more than the surface required. She could see why he had managed to remain untouched for so long. He felt like a man with no edges. She waited until the dancing had drawn most of the room's attention elsewhere, until they stood in a pocket of relative privacy near the far column. Then, as though the thought had arrived casually and unbidden, she let her expression shift, a small puzzled cloud crossing an otherwise clear afternoon. "I had the strangest correspondence this week," she said, in the tone of someone sharing a minor curiosity. "My solicitor in the North flagged a creditor's mark he didn't recognize on some old family paperwork. Something to do with my stepmother's financial arrangements, apparently. A stamp with rather unusual imagery." She tilted her head. "A vulture, of all things. Wings spread. G.V. and Associates." She let out a small, wondering laugh. "Do you know, I cannot find anyone who has heard of them. London finance seems such a labyrinthine world." The change in Voss was almost imperceptible. Almost. A fractional stillness, no more than a half-second's interruption in the fluid ease he wore like a second coat. His eyes, for just that half-second, sharpened from social calculation into something older and more alert. Then it was gone, smoothed over with the practiced speed of a man who had survived many rooms by recovering faster than anyone could be certain they had seen. But Lola had seen it, and 2 feet to her left, half turned toward the dancing as though absorbed in watching the figures, Lady Tia had seen it too. And across the room, wearing the expression of a man attending a perfectly routine social engagement, Lord Ashmore, Tia's oldest and most strategically placed ally, had seen it too. "I'm afraid I can't help you there," Voss said pleasantly. "Finance is rather outside my usual sphere." "Of course," Lola agreed warmly, and let the subject go. She did not need him to confess, she needed him to move. He did within the hour. A quiet word to a younger man near the card-room, a departure earlier than his usual pattern, a certain careful blankness that replaced the ease he'd carried in with, the specific expression of a person recalibrating behind a controlled exterior. Tia appeared at her shoulder the moment he left. "Ashmore's man followed him to the card-room," Tia said quietly. "The name he passed was Hargreave, one of the secondary note-holders. He's warning them," Lola said. "Yes, and tomorrow half of London will know that Lord Voss was seen leaving Almack's early after an unremarkable conversation with a northern heiress." Tia's voice was dry as parchment. "In this city, unexplained urgency is its own confession." By the following morning, the whispers had begun, the soft, inexorable turning of the ton's collective attention, slow as a tide, but as inevitable. By Thursday afternoon, 2 invitations to the Burton Kelly household went unrenewed. By Friday, a third. The great silent machinery of London society had registered its verdict, and it had not come down in Natasha's favor. Lola read the morning's social correspondence over breakfast and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a single quiet breath of satisfaction. One move remained, the most dangerous one, but the ground at last was shifting.
The constables came on a Friday morning, which was, Lola would later reflect, a very Natasha choice of timing. Friday allowed the arrest to circulate through the weekend's social gatherings, the dinners, the card parties, the Sunday promenades, before any legal countermeasure could be mounted. It gave the story maximum exposure in the hours when drawing rooms were fullest and mercy was thinnest. It was, in its horrible way, elegant. She was descending Tia's front steps when they appeared. 2 men in the official brown of the magistrate's office, a third in a solicitor's coat, holding a folded document with the careful reverence people reserved for things they knew would cause damage. "Miss Lola Kelly," the first man said. She stopped. Behind her she heard Tia's sharp intake of breath. "Yes," she said. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "You are charged, on complaint of Lady Natasha Burton Kelly, with the theft of a signet ring, the property of the late Lord Burton Kelly, valued at—" "I know what it's worth," Lola said quietly. Her father's ring.
She had taken it from the Manor's jewelry case the morning after the fire, along with the ledgers, the instinct of a woman who had learned, too late and too painfully, that nothing in that house was safe from Natasha's reach. She had not thought of it as theft, she had thought of it as salvage. The law, it appeared, had been given a different account. The holding room at the magistrate's office was not designed for comfort. It was a plain, cold space, stone floor, a narrow bench along a wall, a single high window that admitted a rectangle of grey London afternoon without warmth or view. Lola sat on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight, which was the physical vocabulary she had developed over years for situations in which composure was the only currency available. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes when she heard voices in the corridor, one official and increasingly strained, one quiet and absolutely immovable. The door opened. Jaden stepped through it with the particular unhurried ease of a man who simply declined to be impeded and found the world rearranging itself accordingly. He was still in his morning coat, which meant Tia had reached him quickly. His expression, when his eyes found hers, was controlled, but she had learned to read what lived behind his control, and what lived there now was a cold, contained fury that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the woman who had arranged this. He sat down beside her on the narrow bench without preamble. The official in the doorway attempted one final objection. "Your Grace, visiting privileges during a detainment period require—" "I am aware of what they require," Jaden said without turning. "I have invoked ducal privilege of attendance. If you wish to contest it, you are welcome to present your objection to the Lord Chief Justice, whom I will be speaking with at his club this evening in any case." A pause. "You may close the door." The door closed. The silence that formed between two people who had been moving very fast and have, for the first time, stopped. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she exhaled slowly. "Humiliated, which is what she intended." "She intended to break your momentum before the hearing," he said it, plainly, as he said most things, not to console but to clarify, which she had always found more useful than comfort. "The hearing is in 11 days. This changes nothing material. It changes how I appear." She turned to look at him, really look, in the way the preceding weeks of London performance had made difficult. "An heiress detained for theft. That is the version circulating through every dinner table tonight." "Tonight's version, yes." His voice was even. "By morning, the version circulating will be that the Duke of Nottingham invoked privilege to remain at her side, and by the end of the week, the story will be that Lady Natasha Burton-Kelly was so threatened by her stepdaughter's evidence that she had her falsely arrested 8 days before a royal court hearing." He met her gaze with the steadiness she had relied upon since the night of the fire. "The dawn will bring your crown," he said quietly. "I am absolutely certain of it." She did not tell him that she believed him. She didn't need to. Outside, London moved through its indifferent Friday evening. Inside the narrow room, she allowed herself to lean, just slightly, just enough, and he remained exactly where he was, immovable, as always. The Royal Courts of Justice received them on a Tuesday, under a sky the colour of old pewter. Lola had been inside courtrooms before, the lower county sessions, the regional land tribunals where she had fought the first territorial phase of this long war. Those rooms had been provincial, practical, built for the quiet administration of local disputes. This was different. The central hall rose above her like the nave of a cathedral built not to God, but to the idea that order, applied with sufficient formality, could hold the world together. She hoped today that the idea was correct. She wore black, deliberate, considered black, without ornament. Tia had suggested something softer, more sympathetic. Lola had declined. She was not here to be sympathized with. She was here to be believed. The gallery filled quickly. Word had moved through London in the preceding days with the quiet velocity of things that cannot be officially confirmed but cannot be stopped. A debt fraud hearing involving a northern estate, a forged signature case, a stepdaughter representing herself before the Crown Debt Commission. By the time the clerk called the room to order, every available bench was occupied. Natasha sat at the claimant's table in deep plum silk, her solicitor arranged around her like a small, expensive fortification. She did not look at Lola. She had not looked at Lola once since entering the room, which told Lola everything she needed to know about where Natasha's confidence currently resided. Lola set the charred ledger before the table in front of her. She placed beside it the 5 forged notes that Jaden had retrieved from Fitch, recovered from a gambling den which would require some careful framing, and Isabelle's written testimony, witnessed and sealed by 2 independent solicitors. Then she folded her hands and waited for the commission to be seated. 3 justices, 1 presiding, Lord Alderton, a man of 60 with the expression of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and retained the capacity to be disappointed by none of it. Good, Lola thought. Cynicism in a judge was a form of fairness. Natasha's solicitor opened for 45 minutes. It was accomplished work, she would acknowledge that privately. He constructed the narrative of a grieving widow managing a chaotic estate, confronted by a stepdaughter who had removed property, destabilized tenancy arrangements, and created legal complications in an already fragile inheritance situation. The forged notes, he argued, were legitimate instruments, signed during a period when Lola had been given estate management authority. The signet ring was demonstrably a family heirloom. Lola listened to all of it without writing a single note. She had already heard every variation of this argument. She knew its architecture the way you came to know the shape of something that had been pressing against you for a very long time. When Alderton invited her to respond, she stood. She began not with the ledger, but with a question addressed to the commission directly. My lords, I would ask you to consider a simple sequence of dates. She walked them through it, unhurriedly, precisely the way Tia had helped her structure it over 3 evenings at the Cavendish Square desk. Her father's death, the first forged loan drawn 11 months later, the simultaneous filing of the contested inheritance claim that blocked Lola from accessing the estate accounts that would have immediately revealed the fraudulent debt. The timing was not coincidence, it was choreography. She placed the charred ledger before the commission and invited their clerk to examine the stamp on the final page, the G.V. and Associates mark. Then she presented documented evidence gathered by Tia's network, connecting Lord Edmund Voss to 3 previous estate acquisitions that had followed an identical pattern: contested inheritance, shadow debt, crown auction. The gallery was very quiet. She presented the 5 forged notes. She walked the commission through a side-by-side comparison with 2 letters in her authentic hand, produced from her father's personal correspondence, the slight leftward lean of the L, the looped tail, the ghost stroke. Then she produced a signed statement from a document examiner engaged 4 days prior, who had identified 17 specific inconsistencies between the forged signatures and her genuine hand. Natasha's solicitor objected 3 times. Alderton sustained none of them. Then she called Isabelle. The room shifted when Natasha's daughter took the stand. Natasha herself went very still, in the particular way of a person who has just watched something they believed was secure become suddenly, visibly loose. Isabelle did not look at her mother. She looked at the commission, and she spoke with the careful, exhausted clarity of someone who had been carrying weight for too long and had finally decided to set it down, regardless of where it fell. She confirmed the location of the forgery equipment. She confirmed that her own name had appeared on 2 subsidiary instruments without her knowledge. She confirmed that she had witnessed her mother in correspondence with G.V. and Associates beginning 14 months after Lord Kelly's funeral. Then she said the thing that made the gallery inhale as one. "My mother told me when I asked about the northern estate that it did not matter what the law said, that she had made certain arrangements that would ensure the land was never truly Lola's." Isabelle's voice was steady. She used the word arrangements the way she used it for everything, as though the world was simply a household to be managed according to her preference. Lola let the silence hold for 3 full seconds before she rose. "My lords," she said quietly, "I have no further witnesses." Alderton delivered the commission's finding 40 minutes later. Fraud established, the debt instruments voided, the Kelly estate confirmed in perpetuity as the sole property of Miss Lola Kelly, undisputed heir. Referral to the Crown Prosecutor regarding Lord Edmund Voss and associated parties. Natasha did not make a sound. She simply became, in the space of a single sentence, a woman without a position or a plan. Lola gathered the charred ledger from the table. She held it for a moment, the scorched cover, the intact pages, the evidence that had survived the fire that was meant to consume it. Then she walked out of the royal courts into the pewter London morning and breathed. The steps of the royal courts faced west, which meant that when Lola emerged into the afternoon, the light came directly at her, pale and autumnal, and entirely indifferent to the significance of the moment. She stood at the top and let it find her face. Behind her, the building continued its formal business. Clerks moved through corridors with documents. Solicitors conferred in low voices. The machinery of the law, having delivered its verdict, reset itself efficiently for the next matter, because justice, she had learned, was less a destination than a process. It arrived, it acted, and it moved on without ceremony. The ceremony, such as it was, she would have to provide herself. They came out 20 minutes after her. Natasha first, because Natasha always arranged to be first. It was a reflex so deeply embedded that even disgrace could not override it. She descended the steps in her plum silk, with her chin at its habitual elevation, and her solicitor at her elbow, speaking rapidly in the tone of a man already calculating which components of a catastrophe could be salvaged. Her face was composed. Her hands, Lola noticed, were not. Isabelle followed 3 steps behind, which had always been her position in her mother's world. But something had shifted in Isabelle's bearing, a subtle reordering, as though a load she had carried in a particular way for years had been redistributed and not yet settled into its new configuration. She was not composed in the way Natasha was composed. She was simply present, moving through the consequences of her own choices with the deliberate tread of someone who had finally decided that forward was the only navigable direction. Their eyes met at the foot of the steps. Lola held Isabelle's gaze for a moment, not with warmth, not with coldness, but with the specific acknowledgement of 2 people who had shared a history too complicated for simple summary and had, in the end, elected different allegiances. She gave a single small nod. Isabelle returned it. Then she looked away. Natasha did not look at Lola at all, which was its own statement, the last available maneuver of a woman who had no remaining moves and knew it. To look would be to acknowledge. Natasha would not give her that, even now. Lola let her have it. She could afford generosity. She had won. The formal consequences arrived by Crown Messenger 3 days later. Lady Natasha Burton Kelly was stripped of the courtesy title she had adopted upon her marriage, the lady that had been her primary weapon for a decade, deployed in every social room and legal document as proof of her legitimacy and superiority. Without Lord Kelly's name to sustain it and the fraud finding on record, the title collapsed like a structure whose foundation had been quietly removed. She was, once again, simply Mrs. Natasha Burton. The northern properties, the dower arrangements, the secondary cottage holdings she had accumulated through a series of transactions that the Crown Prosecutor was now examining with considerable interest, were frozen pending investigation. The social consequences had already preceded the legal ones, as they always did in London. 3 hostesses withdrew invitations, 2 removed her name from their visiting lists entirely. The Almack's patronesses, who had watched Lord Vass depart early from a Wednesday ball 2 weeks prior, required no further information to reach their conclusion. The Tun, having identified which way the current was moving, moved with it. They always did.
Isabelle received a quieter handling. The Commission had noted her cooperation, and Lola's solicitor had submitted a formal statement attesting to the material assistance of her testimony. She was not stripped of anything she actually possessed. What she lost was more abstract, the protection of her mother's name, the infrastructure of a life built on someone else's authority. She left for Edinburgh on a Thursday morning in a hired coach, with a trunk, a letter of introduction to her school friend, and a banker's draft for the first quarter's board that Lola had arranged without drama and without conditions. Lola did not see her go, but she knew the day, and at the approximate hour of the coach's departure, she stood at the north-facing window of Nottingham Manor and thought, briefly and without resolution, about the strange arithmetic of families, what was owed, what was earned, and what could simply, finally be released. She returned to the Kelly estate on a Friday. The tenants knew before she arrived. Word travelled north faster than coaches, always had, and when her carriage came over the ridge road, there were people along the lane, not arranged, not summoned, simply there, the way communities gathered when something that had been uncertain for a long time became certain. Old Mr. Prentice from the East Holding, who had been farming Kellyland since before Lola was born, was standing at the gate. He removed his hat as the carriage passed. It was a small gesture. She felt it in her chest like a bell struck. She stepped out in the late afternoon light and stood on the gravel drive of the house where she had grown up, the house that had been used against her, that had nearly been sold from beneath her, that had survived fire and fraud and the long, patient malice of a woman who had understood its value well enough to want to destroy it. It was still standing. She was still standing. The air smelled of northern heather and turned earth, and the particular clean coldness that came down from the ridge in October, the smell of home, unmistakable and irrevocable, the smell that no forgery could replicate and no creditor could auction. She breathed it in, fully, completely, without the shallow, careful rationing of breath that fear required. The northern girl had come home, and this time she was not leaving.
The chapel had been in the Kelly family longer than the manor house itself. It sat at the edge of the north garden, small and plainly built from the same grey stone as the ridge it faced, with a single bell that had marked every Kelly birth, marriage and burial for 3 generations. Lola's mother had been married there. Her father had been buried from it. It had stood through tenant disputes and inheritance contests and a woman with a match in the dark, utterly indifferent to all of it, the way old stone was indifferent to the temporary urgencies of the people it outlasted. This morning it held white roses and northern heather, wound together along every pew and arch in a combination that had been entirely Lola's choice. The roses for the world she had learned to navigate, the heather for the world she had never agreed to leave behind. The effect was neither purely formal nor purely wild. It was, like most things she built, precisely itself. The bell rang at 10. She dressed in her mother's room, not in her mother's gown, that had not survived the decades, but in the room itself, at the same dressing table, in front of the same oval mirror that had reflected a different bride on a different October morning 30 years prior. Lady Tia stood behind her, arranging the final pins with the focused quiet of a woman who understood that some moments required presence rather than commentary. Almost. "You look," Tia said when the last pin was placed, "like someone who has earned this." Lola met her eyes in the glass. "That is the most Tia Riley thing anyone has ever said at a wedding." "I stand by it." Tia stepped back and assessed the full picture with her characteristic unsentimental precision.
Then something in her expression shifted, briefly, privately, the careful composure softening into something genuine beneath. Your father would have been insufferable with pride, absolutely insufferable. It would have been wonderful. Lola looked at her own reflection, the ivory silk, the simple arrangement of her dark hair, the northern heather threaded through it like a small, deliberate statement, and felt the truth of that settle in her chest alongside everything else the morning carried. Yes, she said quietly, it would have. The chapel was full, not with London, not with the ton or the patronesses or the machinery of the season that had served its purpose and been left behind like scaffolding after construction. The pews held tenants and neighbors and the people of the northern acreage, the ones who had farmed Kelly land and raised Kelly children alongside their own and stood along the lane to watch her carriage come home. Old Mr. Prentice was in the third row with his hat on his knee and his expression arranged into the specific configuration of a man determined not to be seen feeling something. He was failing admirably. Lola walked the aisle without being given away because there was no one left to give her, and she had decided, quietly and without drama, that she had spent enough of her life being transferred between the custody of others. She walked herself, which felt, with every step, exactly correct. Jaden was waiting at the altar. He had dressed with his usual precise understatement, dark coat, no excessive ornamentation, the single concession to occasion being a sprig of northern heather in his buttonhole that she had not arranged and he had not mentioned. He had found it himself, or had it found for him, which amounted to the same thing. He watched her come down the aisle with an expression she had spent months learning to read, not the controlled public face, not the contained fury he wore for enemies, not the careful neutrality of a man managing a difficult room. This was something that lived beneath all of those, quieter, more certain, the look of a man arriving at a place he had been navigating toward for longer than he had admitted to himself. She reached the altar. He offered his hand. She took it. The vows were the traditional form. She had not wanted to write new ones because the old words had survived centuries of human imprecision for good reason. They said what needed saying without requiring elaboration. She spoke them clearly, without trembling, in the voice she used when she meant something without reservation. He spoke them back to her in the same register, quiet and absolute, each word placed with the deliberate weight of a man who did not say things he did not intend to keep. When the chaplain concluded his portion, and the register had been signed, and the witnesses had affixed their names, there was a moment, brief, suspended, before the bell would ring, and the doors would open, and the morning would resume its ordinary motion. Jaden leaned toward her. Not the whisper of strategy, not the low, urgent voice of a man relaying intelligence about syndicate financiers and gambling dens and the movements of their enemies. She had heard all of those whispers, had relied on them, had built a campaign on the information they carried. She knew their register by now as well as she knew her own heartbeat. This was different. His voice was barely sound at all, something that existed only in the small particular space between his mouth and her ear, belonging to no one else in the chapel or the world beyond it.
"You will never have to survive alone again," he said. "Not one more day of it. I promise you that." She closed her eyes for precisely 1 second. Then she turned to face the open doors and the light coming through them and the northern fields beyond. Her fields, her land, her home, with her hand in his and the bell beginning to ring above them. The northern girl was a duchess now, and the kingdom, long contested, was finally, irrevocably at peace. The end. And there it is, dear readers, the final page of Lola and Jaden's extraordinary journey.
From that first flickering match in the darkness of Kelly Manor's archive to the ringing of the chapel bell over the northern heather, you rode every twist of this road alongside them. You felt the cold of that holding-room cell, the heat of the courtroom, the quiet thunder of a whispered vow. None of it would have meant anything without you in these pages with us. Lola walked herself down that aisle because she had learned, through fire and fraud and 43,000 pounds of beautiful lies, that she was enough. And Jaden stood at that altar because some men, the very best of them, know exactly what they have when they see it and refuse to let the world talk them out of it. What a pair! What a story! What a privilege to tell it! If this journey moved you, surprised you, or kept you reading just one more chapter past your bedtime, we would love to know. Drop a comment below and tell us your favorite moment. Was it Jaden in the gambling den, Lola in the courtroom representing herself before the crown, or perhaps that final whisper at the altar that was never meant for anyone else? Your thoughts genuinely matter, and they keep these stories alive. And if you are not yet part of this community, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never find yourself arriving late to the next story. New worlds, new characters, and new love stories that will make you feel every single thing are already on their way. Like this story, share it with someone who loves a heroine who fights back, and never miss another chapter. Until the next first page, thank you. Truly.